Welcome to Water Sessions, a Water Council podcast. Mention any risk anywhere in the world, and you'll find a connection to water. We explore water challenges and the future of water innovation with experts in the water community, sharing stories and perspectives that you won't hear anywhere else. A special thanks to our series sponsor, Rexnord, a global leader of advanced water management solutions and smart technologies. Rexnord solves smarter for its customers to deliver hygienic, safe, and efficient products that protect human health and the environment. Additional support is provided by today's session sponsor, the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation. And now, the host of today's water session, Charles Fishman.
Today on the podcast, we have Dan Berger from Charleston, South Carolina. Dan is best known in Charleston as the co-founder and first chairman of something called the Charleston Resilience Network, an organization that helped the communities in and around Charleston tackle climate change over the last 6 or 7 years. Charleston Resilience Network pulled together people from local companies, small businesses, the colleges and universities, governments, regulatory agencies, all into the same room to talk together, understand the nature of what climate change was doing, and let them work together to come up with effective solutions that crossed the political and organizational boundaries. Dan's about to start a new job up in Washington, D.C. with the National Academy of Sciences as a senior program officer, helping other communities do exactly what he did as his side job in Charleston, create organizations that cross their own organizational and governmental boundaries to help those cities and communities in coastal America confront climate change on a local basis. While he was in Charleston for 16 years, Dan Berger professionally was with the state of South Carolina with the Office of Ocean and Coastal Resource Management. Well, Dan Berger, thanks for joining us today. You're speaking to us from Charleston. You're about to leave Charleston and move back up to Annapolis in the Washington, D.C. area for a new job. But you've lived in Charleston for 16 years. And a lot of your work in Charleston has been about water and helping people think about how to manage water. What is life like in Charleston now compared to when you arrived there in terms of the impact that climate change is having on that whole beautiful coastal port region? How do you notice what's going on now compared to 16 years ago?
Sure. Well, first, thanks, Charles. Thank you so much for having me on your show. I really appreciate the opportunity. I think anyone who has been to Charleston, and it's commonly referred to as being part of the Low Country, Charleston is really defined by its relationship with the water and how the land interacts with marsh and wetlands, Charleston Harbor, the Atlantic Ocean. It's also noticeably flat. Apart from the just sheer natural beauty of the region, first thing my wife and I noticed when we moved to Charleston 16 years ago was the rain, the quickness of storm development, and just the sheer volume of water that can drop from the sky in very short order.
It's almost tropical.
It certainly is. It's a subtropical environment, that's for sure. But like our hometown of Annapolis, Charleston is defined by this relationship with water. In my line of work with the state of South Carolina for many years, I had a particular focus on coastal hazards and working with communities to understand the nature of coastal hazards and to develop strategies to not only preserve their beachfront and their economies, but also how individuals can enjoy those resources and protect property and the like. In the background of all this is this insidious nature of climate hazards, particularly sea level rise. So sea level rise in Charleston has increased by over 1 foot over the last 100 years, and that pace really has only quickened. So this doesn't only increase the threat of storm surge, but also challenges conventional stormwater management infrastructure and drainage patterns.
People get a little confused. A foot over a century, that's an inch a decade. How big a deal is that? But Charleston literally sits not just adjacent to the water, it's out in the water. What does a foot really mean?
Well, Charleston is very low-lying. much of the historic peninsula is actually built on artificial fill. So we have a compounding threat of not only sea level rise, but we have in certain areas, the land is actually sinking. And when your stormwater system depends on gravity and pumps to be able to move water from neighborhoods and from streets back out into the harbor, that system gets compromised as the water level that you are pumping to continues to increase. That is particularly noticeable when we have a high tide and a storm event simultaneously, and there is quite literally nowhere for that water to go.
I guess what I was curious about is whether your experience of living in Charleston related to the natural environment, to climate change, is different today as you prepare to move back north than it was when you went there 16 years ago, and if you can give us a sense of how it is different.
Absolutely. So adaptation, particularly to flooding, is now front page news almost every day in Charleston. These issues have now been understood by policymakers, decision makers, community-based stakeholders as being the challenge of our time. It's not simply an environmental issue. We are well beyond that. This is now an economic issue, it's a social issue. And really, the work that's been accomplished over the last, decade plus reflects that there is a much stronger appreciation for not only the physical vulnerabilities that we experience, but the opportunities for positive change. And how do we work collectively, not just as a city or a county, but really as a region, to embrace this challenge and work collectively to ensure that this region continues to prosper for another 350 years.
You mentioned three things, and I'd like you to riff on each of them before we go into this idea of how you tackle the challenge. You said there's a literal infrastructure challenge. There's water arriving at places in the last 15 years, 16 years where it didn't used to, but that Charleston now recognizes that water presents both an economic challenge and a social challenge. Why would that kind of flooding be anything of concern beyond the stormwater department of Charleston and the counties around it?
So the annual and decadal trend of flooding events continues to increase. In fact, we set a new record in 2019 with 89 flood events in the Charleston region. So these flood events, individually and cumulatively, impact the daily routines of commuters, schools, businesses, tourists, and is really beginning to drive home this realization that the situation is only going to become more challenging. In the background of all this, Charleston is experienced really unprecedented economic growth. Development has been explosive, and Charleston is now the largest city in the state with a metropolitan population of over 800,000. So there's continued demand for new commercial space, housing, and infrastructure that has continued to alter the landscape and challenge this balance of land and water. Fortunately, now there are many efforts on reclaiming that balance by looking at innovative ways to manage water, to recognize that we can't simply build walls and hold water out, that we've got to change our relationship and find ways to integrate water into our built environment.
And what's the social impact?
There's virtually not a single community in the Charleston region that doesn't experience a flooding impact to one degree or another. Unfortunately, some of the most acutely affected communities are also communities of color, communities of lower economic means, but these communities are also the underpinnings of our hospitality industry, our tourism-based economy. So when we have a major flooding event and individuals are not able to get to work or get to work on time, when their car has been flooded for the second or third time in a year. These have, real economic impact to families who are not in position to afford these repetitive losses and repetitive disruptions. As we're working forward, we've really taken a step back to look at water management not simply as a physical challenge, but as a social and an economic challenge. How do we apply a lens of equity and livability to the decision-making process so that we can help ensure that the communities and the individuals in communities who make Charleston work are out of harm's way, are protected, that their lives are less disrupted than they currently are now?
You've already described a really complicated situation. Climate change is a slow-moving process that's only making life harder in Charleston. At the same time, the region is so attractive that it's pulling in all kinds of economic development, exactly what you want. But those two things are not just in conflict, they make each other more challenging. It's harder to manage climate change while you're busy building garden apartments and office parks with an old plan that assumed a different kind of climate and a different kind of environment. And climate change makes all those things harder to accomplish in real time. Tell me about the organization that you helped create called the Charleston Resilience Network. I know the creation of that organization is kind of interesting, but take listeners all the way forward to this moment in time when you've got a working organization.
So the Charleston Resilience Network was established in 2014. So we've been active for just about 6 years at this point. And the Resilience Network, or CRN, it's a collaborative effort among public, private, academic, and nonprofit organizations who are working together to reduce barriers to high-quality information, align strategies, and identify opportunities to collaborate in ways that begins to move the needle on resilience throughout the region. A primary purpose of CRN is to serve as a forum to share science-based information and discuss innovative approaches to local and regional climate hazard challenges. Our success really depends on the participation of experts and stakeholders across the region to build consensus around the issues and really strive for greater uniformity of action across traditional boundaries, whether it be by sector or political boundaries. And I think, this really starts by demystifying the science behind the problem and empowering communities to utilize that science and information in their planning and decision-making processes. However, it really doesn't end there. It's critical to also consider the human dimension and apply that equity lens to the decision-making process so that we ensure that we don't just freeze Charleston in time, but we're actively looking to a future that is supportive of a diverse economy and diverse communities.
It might be worth drilling into a couple of those things. The Charleston Resilience Network is a freestanding organization. No one's required to join it. It wasn't created by the state of South Carolina or the southeast region of the EPA. You actually created it with help from some colleagues. But you said the job is to demystify science and to act as a forum. The challenge in a problem like this, and communities have often realized these challenges, it is a little bit like a road system or economic development authority. If you're going to manage climate change, you need everybody to participate. You need everybody to understand the problem in the same way. And so it sounds like when you say demystify the science and a forum, you are trying to create a place where all the local governments could come together, the big employers, small employers or representatives of small employers, conservation groups, the port, all kinds of quasi-governmental agencies, the tourism authority, the economic development authority, could sit in the same room once a month or 6 times a year and begin to understand, here's what's happening to our community. And also to have access to the people who are doing that analysis. What happens after you do that?
Right. No, you hit the nail on the head. That's exactly where it starts. It starts with convening and striving for consensus through a process. All of this depends on relationships and trust. And that is not a process you can short circuit. That takes time. And I think that's where the Charleston Resilience Network has really been successful. That when we got this effort underway, we all carved time out of our already busy schedules in our lunch hours, nights, and weekends to get some legs under this. And we started with the relationships that we already had. We really formed as a coalition of the willing.
What happens in that room? When you say relationships, I mean, Charleston's not a small town. It's not a town of 20,000, but it's not LA. It's not New York. I assume most people sort of know each other. Who are you getting to talk to each other and listen to each other who wouldn't in a typical day?
Well, you're exactly right. And I think that's what makes Charleston such a compelling case study for successful adaptation, is that we are at a scale where great things are possible. We are at a scale where folks do know each other. They interact. We are fortunate to have some fabulous academic institutions that call Charleston home. And being able to not only leverage the expertise, the technical expertise of our academic partners and our partners in the engineering community and the nonprofit sector, the conservation community, but whereas even just several years ago, there was not a mechanism to convene these organizations to talk about varying perspectives and approaches to addressing this challenge. What we continue to need to get away from is a very ad hoc approach to water management problems in a specific area. It's important to address those specific challenge areas, but we need to develop some guiding principles, agreeing on terminology, agreeing on what types of data at what scale is going to be utilized to make the best possible decision without being paralyzed in the analytical process. That we've got to accelerate the rate of adaptation. And in order to do that, you have to have consensus on the fundamentals. We don't have this problem solved. I don't know if you are ever able to claim that you have solved climate change and climate adaptations. And as the situation on the ground continues to evolve, so does the Charleston Resilience Network.
We're, of course, recording in the summer of 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, and the summer is turning out not to be a pause in that pandemic. But take us back to 2019. How did the network work last year? So people get a sense of, if I create the Austin Resilience Network or the Miami Resilience Network, what's it going to look like 6 years on? What happened? How many meetings did you have? Who went to those? What did they get out of them? What happens when you're not meeting? Who even calls a meeting?
A lot to unpack in that question. So back in 2014, when we got the network underway, as I mentioned, it really was a coalition of the willing organizations, those organizations that had programs in place that addressed a facet of what has now become resilience. Even at the time, the term resilience was not too common. It was often confused with the term sustainability, but we adopted that term to examine how the region is prepared to absorb, respond, and adapt to not only the major catastrophic events, but this chronic disruption associated with climate hazards. We looked at the expertise that was already available to us in the community, and we invited those individuals in. It didn't take long to get a lot of interest and participation among a suite of actors across public, private, academic, and non-governmental organizations that wanted to participate in this, that wanted to get beyond the silo of their individual organization.
Tick off some people who are members, like to the degree that you're comfortable using names. Who's a member?
Sure. So some of our original partners included the City of Charleston, the County of Charleston, South Carolina Sea Grant Consortium, the College of Charleston. We have active participation from non-governmental organizations such as the South Carolina Aquarium. We have for-profit participation from organizations like Wells Fargo. But as a complement to the active participation from local stakeholders is bringing in advisory from key federal agencies, including NOAA, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and the Department of Homeland Security. So that as we're developing our strategy locally, that it falls within frameworks set forth by the federal government. Now, mind you, our challenge, as with any challenge of any community, it's not going to be solved by Washington, D.C. However, those agencies are critically important partners when you're developing a strategy to make sure that your efforts are aligning with federal frameworks that will allow funding and technical support to become readily available.
Okay, so what did this look like for participants last year?
2019 was a really remarkable year for Charleston. Many planning processes were well underway within municipalities and also counties in the region to integrate resilience elements into their existing planning processes, which is, it sounds like low-hanging fruit, but it's a challenge. Working with planning commissions that are very established in their routine for comprehensive planning or hazard mitigation planning. But to introduce this resilience element that reflects the best available localized data and information is a huge win. We've also seen municipalities create opportunities for reciprocity in planning processes. As you mentioned earlier, climate change and water management does not respect political boundaries. And so we're beginning to see the integration of a more regional approach. What is really inspiring, in 2019, Charleston went through a really robust visioning and planning process called Dutch Dialogues, which is a process that is stewarded by the Water Institute of the Gulf and Wagner Ball Architects out of New Orleans, and also the Kingdom of the Netherlands, to have a peer-to-peer planning exercise to match experts from Louisiana to experts in Charleston to experts in the Netherlands to reimagine what Charleston can be once it redefines its relationship with water. Once we find ways to live with water, to create landscapes that embrace this really special environment that we have in a way that not only reduces our vulnerabilities to things like storm surge and sea level rise, but also creates value, that creates multiple benefits through the implementation of a coherent intervention strategy.
If I understand it right, the Dutch Dialogues, they see their relationship to water not as a problem, but as an asset. And a place like Charleston may have spent the last 100 years, or in some ways 250 years, seeing its relationship to water as invaluable. Now, climate change makes water look like a problem. And I guess the Dutch Dialogue process, take a step back. Let's think about how you're trying to wrestle with this. What's your actual goal? What are your tools? That's a little bit what the Resilience Network itself is also trying to do in a much longer term way. It sounds like what you guys are saying, or what you've come to, is climate change is going to create problems. But if you view all of those things just as problems, rather than as a chance to say, maybe we're thinking about this the wrong way, it's a chance to use the problems we're suddenly experiencing to think about what kind of community we want, not the week after tomorrow, but 5 years from now and 20 years from now, and to use all of these building relationships to do that.
Absolutely. I think the experience through Dutch Dialogues and utilizing the experience of the Dutch and also the domestic experience from folks in Louisiana is looking at the opportunity that can sometimes be obscured by the challenge. And working beyond the traditional approaches to water management. So really beyond the technology itself are a set of core planning principles that are incredibly valued now in this region. I think of the concepts of building with nature and creating multiple benefits through intervention processes that have been applied in New Orleans and in the Netherlands, and how they are directly applicable to Charleston. So sometimes we focus too simply on moving water or trying to block it out entirely. But what we do now is think about how we manage water to create real value in communities, from the creation of new community spaces to enhance mobility and recreational opportunities, and creating safe, affordable housing that supports the people who really make the economy of Charleston work.
Can you pause and give me an example of what that means, working with nature and creating multiple benefits? Those are phrases, but if somebody's listening who hasn't imagined water that way, what does that mean? Give me an example.
Sure. So I think one of the most compelling examples of building with nature is respecting water and how water moves within the environment. And so it begins with understanding how your land historically has been utilized, what your development patterns are, where do you have communities in areas that are difficult to defend against water intrusion, and then where do you have areas that have not been developed but are really suitable for development in the long term. So how do you then create an incentive structure to transfer the development interests of low-lying, high-hazard areas to these areas that are less flood-prone? But building with nature moves beyond that. It's looking at opportunities to harness the storage capacity of wetlands, to understand how soils, although not often seen and very underappreciated, have a tremendous water storage capacity to them. So how do we look at the development of our landscape, not just horizontally, but vertically, and understanding how we can continue to develop economically as a region without putting folks in harm's way, and really harnessing the awesome power of nature to help us in that process. Too often, the development patterns in this region have resulted in the filling of freshwater wetlands, the clear cutting of forested areas. Those types of actions, individually and cumulatively, have a real impact on the landscape's ability to naturally manage and store water. And so we now see the conversation shifting to how do we revisit our land use regime? How do we look at policies and regulations in a way that respect the challenge before us and can provide greater consistency so that those who seek to develop in this area understand why the rules are in place and that the rules are in everyone's best interest.
For people who are listening to you talk, Dan, and think, I can imagine how something like a resilience network connecting big employers, conservation groups, quasi-governmental agencies, planning boards, scientists, university people, how that would really help us if we could bring those people together to talk to each other who may work alongside each other but not talk to each other. What's your advice for someone trying to do what you have done in the last 6 years in Charleston and what you're going to go to your new job to do?
So I think a successful network begins with not the science, but rather understanding what motivates your community and its decision makers, and recognizing that people want to be empowered to play a role in the creation of a resilient future for their families and businesses. So as a network, a first step is to really understand the community that you intend to serve, and then develop relationships with the individuals, the organizations, the institutions that drive that community, that region. I can't emphasize enough the importance of relationships. Relationships matter. Without relationships, you don't have trust. Without trust, you can't collaborate. One of the key efforts and successes of the Charleston Resilience Network is the creation of space for learning and for relationships to be established and to develop. Again, you can't short circuit this part of the process. Relationship developing takes time, but it is fundamental to moving the needle on resilience. So where we have spent a lot of time is creating opportunities for experts and community leaders and political leaders and lay community members to share the same space, to discuss these issues, to understand not just what is driving the flooding problems that we experience in Charleston, but to understand what are the possibilities that lay before us when we can begin to collaborate. Once we ingest this information, which can be overwhelming, it can be paralyzing, but the more you talk about it, the more buy-in you achieve, the more you create space for innovation and for thought leadership to emerge. This did not happen overnight. As you mentioned, we've been at this for about 6 years now. But what we have done through this network is lay the groundwork for better decision making. And now we're beginning to see the fruit of that labor. We're beginning to see communities working together and thinking in a regional approach to water management and climate resilience. We're seeing the development of very specific sea level rise and flooding adaptation strategies at the municipal level. We recognize that if we don't successfully address this component of climate adaptation, that we stand to lose ground on much of the prosperity that this region has enjoyed over the last many, many decades. So the more we're able to collaborate and work together, the more we secure that prosperous future for the region.
It sounds like a resilience network is something that before you do it, it's hard to imagine pulling the threads together. But 6 years on, it seems like the folks in Charleston might imagine that it would be hard to get done what they need to get done without it. It goes from being non-existent to being indispensable if you're able to create it.
Absolutely. These successful adaptation is not easy. There will be trade-offs. There will be price tags, but you have to maintain the relationships necessary to talk about these issues, to just lay bare the underlying data and facts of the situation. And again, getting back to relationships, being able to know who to call for the information you need to make a good decision. It's been incredibly valuable to get the really robust research that's occurring in our academic institutions off campus, to get it into the conversation, to put a face on the science, that people genuinely care about this city, about this region. We've had major flooding events every year for the last several years. This is real. People are paying attention and they're demanding action. And now we're creating a space to have these conversations and to link those with information and expertise with those who need it.
With those with problems. Dan, you have been so gracious and so generous with your time. You're going to be in the business of helping people do exactly what you did on the ground in Charleston. If it's okay, we're going to put your contact information in the podcast notes, the episode notes, so people who want to figure out how to take the next 3 steps in what you've done, the first 3 steps, can contact you. Is that okay?
That's fabulous. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Dan.
Thank you, Charles.
Thanks for joining us today. Special thanks to our series sponsor, Rexnord. Additional support is provided by the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation, along with Badger Meter and Evoqua. Don't miss a beat. Subscribe to Water Sessions today.